What are the odds? Continued on page 90. I was living with my grandma. 2 hours from home, from my folks, my friends, and my girlfriend, Donna. Eventually, I hit on an idea. The feeder pig market was going gangbusters, and Uncle Al was making a mint. Why didn't I raise and sell my own pigs? Mom and Fred had their hobby farm back in Carver. I could set up my business there. As the saying goes, it seemed like a good idea at the time. I managed to get a small bank loan, built a pen on Mom and Fred's hobby farm, and bought 60 frisky 40-pound piglets. And then almost immediately, the bottom fell out of the pig market. I had paid $65 for each pig and was forced to sell every one of them at a catastrophic discount. Now I not only owed the bank about $4,000 for pigs, but I also owed the feed company a couple of thousand and a bookie $10,000 for some baseball games that hadn't fallen my way. I racked my brain. How could I pay back the money? Solution: I would go to Las Vegas and count cards. I was going to do it right this time, I promised myself. I would be frugal and hyper focused. I would follow Voss's rules, and I wouldn't have a single drink. Borrowing some gas money from my grandma, I jumped into my beat up old van and headed west. On the way, I came up with a plan. I had already mapped out all the casinos. I knew I would have to bounce around between them, never staying too long at any one so that I didn't attract attention. My goal was to make $300 a night, which wa- which I would send back to my mom daily. When I rolled into Las Vegas a couple of days later, it was so hot I swear you could have boiled water on the dashboard, at least 120 degrees. I took that into account as I put my plan in motion, trying to win my money as early in the evening as possible so I could sleep in my van during the coolest hours. Eventually, I figured out how to sneak into the Stardust pool, and I would spend my days sleeping on a lounge chair, catching little bits of Casey Kasem's American Top 40 between stretches of shut eye. For 40 days, I was a machine, sleeping at the pool by day and counting at night. Every morning, I sent $300 home. I knew a lot about cards by then. I had even read a book on how to catch a cheat. One night, I was sitting at a casino table when I got a surprise. None of the players were cheating. The dealer was cheating. I spotted him second dealing me the second card in the deck instead of the one off the top. Excited to have caught him, I called over the two pit bosses. This guy is cheating me, and I can prove it, I said. The next card is going to be the Jack of Diamonds. Why would you do I looked right at the dealer and said, "You're in trouble, buddy." Sure enough, he flipped over the Jack of Diamonds. I didn't have time to say anything else before the pit bosses circled the table, picked me up, and dragged me to the front of the house, where they threw me through a pair of swinging doors out into the street. It was just like you see in the old westerns. I lay on the sidewalk as they stared down at me. "Come back here, and we'll kill you," one of them said. Suddenly, I realized I had forgotten a critical fact. The dealer works for the casino. But the most defining moment of the trip happened at the Flamingo. I was up $500 before a pit boss came over and asked me to leave the table. He knew I was counting. Since I had already overshot my daily earnings goal of $300, I decided to play some slots. It would be the only time during this 40-day trip that I would gamble. Progressive slots machines were relatively new at the time. The big draw was that the jackpot just kept building until someone won it. That night, the jackpots at the Flamingos' three progressive slots were up to 1.5 million. Winning that kind of money was just a fantasy, of course. Still, I thought, wow, that's all I'd need. I sat there and plugged all three machines for a while. I was winning some and losing some when this young guy and his family walked up behind me. It was the kid's 21st birthday. "Do you mind if we play one of the slot machines?" he asked. The kid and his family only wanted one pull, just to say he had done it. "Sure, go ahead," I said. After all, it was his birthday. I stepped aside. The kid plugged in three silver dollars and pulled the lever. Then I heard some of the worst sounds I've ever heard in my life. The machine started to jingle and ring and flash bright lights. The kid and his family leapt into the air, then started laughing and hugging each other. The kid had won the jackpot. For a couple of moments, I stood there in shock. I had been one pull away, that pull away, from $1.5 million. That was change your life money, especially back then. Suddenly, I needed to get out of there fast. The family was still celebrating, and I just couldn't watch anymore. I spent the rest of the night going from casino to casino, replaying the events of the night over and over in my head. The worst thing was that the news was everywhere, all over the strip. Tommy Bananas wins $1.5 million on his 21st birthday at the Flamingo. No matter where I went, I couldn't get away from it. At that time in my life, that near win was the most devastating feeling I had ever experienced. Somehow I managed to spend the rest of that trip sticking to the plan, and as soon as I had enough money to pay back my bookie, the bank, the feed company, and my grandma, I was out of there. I had done it. Accomplished what I came for. But it had taken me 40 days to dig myself out of debt, and I had spoken to virtually no one besides dealers and pit bosses the entire time. It had been lonely, drudging work. I missed my family and friends even more than I had working for Uncle Al. As I drove away from Vegas, I knew I would never count cards again. Darren listened to my story and was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "But you're saying that when you follow the rules, you win?" "You'll lose some hands," I said. "But at the end of the night, if you follow the system, you pretty much always come out ahead." "Then why did you quit?" Darren asked. Like I said, it was really, really lonely. Plus, Voss was right. I always gave in to gambling. Those 40 days were the only time I ever did it right. "Well, why wouldn't you card count again?" Darren said. "And do it right again." His question hit me like a lightning strike. Chapter 13, Casino Bound. Sometime later, Darren and I headed off to bed. As I lay there, my head spun with excitement. With Schmidt's in decline, I needed a new way to make money. I was a small town guy with a high school education and no skills to speak of, but I didn't like the idea of working for someone else. What if I took Boss's refresher course and tried counting cards again? As a professional counter, I could combine cards, which I loved, with mathematics and probability, which I also loved. I knew I couldn't call Voss in the middle of the night, and morning seemed an eternity away. Unable to sleep, I let my mind drift back to my first course in card counting. Voss Spanos was a stout, swarthy Greek who had first become fascinated with the game of blackjack years before. When he was a student in Greece, He had gone on to earn a PhD in mathematics at the University of Minnesota and stayed in the area to teach his system of card counting. I tracked down Voss in Minneapolis and signed up for his class, which he held in a huge old brick house south of Lake Street. Voss had the whole bottom level set up like a casino gaming floor with real blackjack tables. The course lasted 6 months and, if I recall correctly, cost $900. Each class was small so that he could work closely with his students. I took the class with two guys I didn't know, Russ and Pete. We memorized the matrices and which track the occurrence and relative advantage to the house or player of tens. Mm. We memorized the matrices which track the occurrence and relative advantage to the house or player of tens, face cards, and aces versus the numbers 2 through 6. Sevens, eights, and nines don't count. This required putting in hours and hours at home. On class days, we played at Boss's tables, for which he hired real dealers. Using the matrix numbers, we learned to predict the next card that would be played. Meanwhile, Boss would pace behind us, hands clasped behind his back, barking rapid fire commands in his thick Greek accent. Hit, hit, hit. You must be fast and always thinking, or when someone made a mistake, pour, pour, pour. I soaked it up like a sponge. I understood the sequences and matrices, and there was a logic to it all that appealed to me. In addition to the matrices and style of play, Voss taught us to look for casinos that offered what he called the right conditions. In a nutshell, you want to go head to head with a dealer rather than count at a table with other players. That way you can play as many hands as possible. Also, you want the dealer to go deep into the deck or deep into the shoe if he or she is dealing from multiple decks shuffled together. This allows you to establish a good running count and identify when the advantage has swung your way. Playing with one deck, you have to start the count over every time the dealer shuffles. Finally, for good conditions, you want betting limits high enough that you can make a decent profit on each hand. If you don't have that, you could win for a week and still not earn enough money to make it worth your time. As part of the course, Russ, Pete, and I made a couple of practice runs to Las Vegas, and as Voss had predicted, I found that I like to cut corners instead of grinding out a long series of small, steady wins. I like to press my bets when I had the advantage. In other words, a deck rich in face cards and aces in Voss's system, you could increase your bets within limits when you had the advantage, but I would go well beyond the limit. Observing that tendency, Voss understood I was a gambler at heart and wouldn't succeed as a counter. Still, my conversation with Darren had electrified me. I forgot all about the drudgery and loneliness of counting and focused instead on the glamorous idea of making a living at cards. Back in the 80s, I developed an act. See, on the one hand, card counting isn't illegal as long as you're not using some kind of technology, like a signaling buzzer, for example. On the other hand, casinos hate card counters and will kick them out if they're caught, just like those pit bosses had once tossed me out on my can. Why? Because of that 1.5% advantage over the house. Casinos hate anything that costs them money. That's why, whenever I went counting, I gulped down an endless stream of free cocktails to fool the pit bosses and the bubble people. That's what I call the professional counters and card cheats casinos hired to watch the gaming tables. This surveillance took place via live camera feeds installed in inverted plastic domes that hang down from the ceiling. Bubbles. As I played, I kept the cocktails coming. Already a regular drinker, I had a high tolerance for alcohol, but the casino people didn't know that. I also kept a running conversation with the dealer and any players who happened to be at my table. The casino watchers usually, though not always, thought I was too drunk and chatty to be counting cards. The morning after Darren and I talked, I called Voss. He said it would be at least 2 weeks before I would be able to get into his refresher course. I decided I couldn't wait that long. Immediately, I made the rounds between the bank and the bar till, draining both like an idiot. Then I jumped in my truck and took off for Kansas City carrying at least 2 8 balls of cocaine. I had a white camper shell on my truck, so I figured I could sleep in the truck bed to save money on hotels. 6 hours later, I arrived at a major riverboat casino, which was really a building moored to a pier, and headed to the blackjack tables. It had been decades since I had counted, but I figured I remember enough about Voss's matrices to give it a try on my own. Trouble was, I couldn't find good conditions. All the tables had betting limits so tight that I would not be able to make money there, no matter how long I sat to play. Finally, I headed to the craps table, drawn there as surely as metal to a magnet. You have to understand that my gambling addiction was like an autopilot with bad programming. I made bad decisions like these without even realizing it. In this case, I stepped up to a craps table, rolled the dice once, then stayed there all weekend. Though my luck turned solidly against me, I refused to leave. I called this playing through, and it usually required a lot of cocaine. Whether I was losing in a casino or had a problem to solve elsewhere, I would often play through, staying up for days, refusing to surrender until my luck changed or I'd solved my problem. It didn't always work, and it didn't that night in Kansas City. Within hours, I lost all the money I'd brought except for 6 crumpled $1 bills, some of which I'd used to snort cocaine on the way down from Minnesota. The only reason I still had those was because they were stuffed in a random pocket. Finally, at 3 a.m., I stomped out of the casino, broke and furious. On the way to my truck, I berated myself. I had just told Darren I would do it right this time, but I apparently had no self control whatsoever. I had just blown every bit of extra money Karen and I had in the world. I was still a gambler, just like Boss said. When I got out to my truck, I rolled up one of those dollar bills and inhaled a huge line of cocaine to numb my rage. It didn't help much, still beating myself up for being so stupid. I steered out of the parking lot. I figured if I got started right away, I'd make it home by mid morning, in time to spend most of the weekend with Karen and the kids. Not knowing the area well, I steered down one dark street after another looking for Interstate 35. My friend Wayne Hilk had told me there were some seriously dangerous areas in Kansas City and warned me not to get lost. Now my truck rumbled over a street so torn up it looked like a war zone in a neighborhood that didn't look much better. I drove slowly, looking left and right for a turn that would lead to the highway. Then I hit a massive pothole and my front end took a wild bounce. A second passed before I heard a crash behind me. I braked to a stop, looked in the rearview mirror, and saw that my camper shell had flown off the truck bed and was lying in the street. Because of the broken streetlights, the night was pitch black. Reluctantly, I got out of the truck and I looked around. I couldn't see much, just a battered neighborhood that looked abandoned. I walked back and inspected the camper shell. A couple of the clamps that held it in place seemed to have taken a beating. Would they still work? Even if they did, how was I going to get the shell back on my truck? I knew I couldn't do it alone, and I definitely couldn't stay here all night. Should I just leave it? Just then, two guys came walking out of the dark toward me. As I got closer, I could see that one of them was holding a gun. I know I should have been afraid, but in that moment, all I could feel was anger. It was shaping up to be a lousy weekend, and at this point, I'd had enough. Put your fucking gun away, I roared as they got close. I've got all of $6 on me, and you can each have three. But first, you're gonna help me put this camper shell back on my truck. Fits of rage like this one had continued to plague me since the gas station incident, and still didn't know why. This time I was still so angry with myself over my rash, spur of the moment trip to Kansas City that a guy with a pistol seemed like the least of my problems. This These would-be robbers were young. I didn't wait for them, but grabbed the camper shell and started dragging it toward the truck. They looked at each other, then, without a word, walked over to the camper shell and helped me lift it back onto the truck bed. As soon as they finished, they started walking away. Get back here, I yelled after them. I told you I had $6 on me. I'm good for my word. Then, strangely, I felt guilty for yelling at these guys, even though they were about to rob me. So I added, and I've got cocaine if you want to do a line. They looked back at me like I was crazy, then disappeared into the night. I just shook my head. Why does all this crazy stuff happen to me? I thought yet again. Why do I keep getting into these bizarre scrapes, then getting out again? I attached the camper shell as well as I could with the mangled clamps, then drove carefully down the pocked streets street so that I wouldn't lose it again. After about half a mile, I saw a police car. The officer flipped on his emergency lights and I pulled over. Do you know why? Do you know where you're at? The officer asked through my window. No, not really, I said. I'm trying to find I-35. I guess I'm lost. The cop gave a little laugh. Yeah, you're lost all right. You're in one of the worst areas in Kansas City. That neighborhood you just came out of? We don't even go in there. Really? I said, smiling. I just had two really nice guys help me out back there. My anger over my impatience and my losses in Kansas City solidified my determination to repeat Voss's course and do it right. After my refresher, I began a series of weekend counting excursions, not making enough money to get rich, but enough to justify the trips. I saw these absences both as adventures and as necessary to keep my family afloat. In between, I tried very hard to keep my promises to Karen and the kids, but those boundaries soon began to crumble away. We would make plans. Hey, we're going to do X today. Then didn't have time, but because I wanted to do crack and then I'd make up an excuse to cancel, not because I wasn't physically capable or didn't have time, but because I wanted to do crack instead. Charlie and Darren were young, 11 or 12, and I had always loved to take them hunting and fishing. Duck and goose hunting, in particular, were my passion, something I had done since I was 9 years old. Now, though, when we'd go, I didn't dress the boys properly, or I ran out of time to get the right licenses, or generally just wasn't as responsible a parent because I was too busy with my addiction. Then, on a local fishing trip, I really crossed the line. This particular day, we were meeting a friend named Troy at a lake a couple of miles from my house. The kids were excited as usual. When they were both little, I had taught them to bait their hooks and cast their lines. There was nothing like watching the thrill on their faces when they reeled in a big one. We made the short drive, parked on the side of the road, walked out through a field, down an embankment, and through some woods to a big lake. Troy showed up a few minutes later with a guy I didn't know. His name was Alex. Not too long after we set up to fish, Alex whispered, Do you guys want to go smoke crack? I said no right away. I looked at Charlie and Darren happily casting away from the lake shore. I had no intention of leaving my boys. Then I caught movement from the corner of my eye. Alex and Troy were already headed for the woods. A switch flipped inside me, and suddenly the lure of that crack high started pulling me after them like a 10-pound line. Within minutes, I was crouched in the woods with Troy and a perfect stranger sucking on a crack pipe while my boys fished alone. Even as the whoosh came, even as I hit that high, I felt an all consuming shame. I gazed at Charlie and Darren from my hiding place in the trees, separated from my sons by a wall of secrecy. This time could have been so special, I thought, and it was being stolen right in front of my eyes. I was at the same time both the victim and the thief.